Welcome to Parivartan Darpan, a platform initiated by HDFC Bank's social initiative Parivartan, which brings together speakers, intellectuals, significant stakeholders to deliberate over crucial subjects impacting the society at large. Parivartan, which literally symbolizes change, and change needs to be consistent and constant. Change needs to have an introspection and enhance the ability to innovate and have a lasting impact. And to do so, it needs a platform that acts as a darpan, which is a mirror to oneself. With this, we commence the very first episode of Parivartan Darpan. I would quickly like to introduce our speakers for today as well. We have Mr. Apurva Oza, the Chief Executive Officer of Aga Khan Rural Support Program, India. We have Ms. Tini Sahni. She's currently the Chief Executive of Aga Khan Foundation in India. Our next speaker is Libby Johnson. Libby is the Executive Director of Gram Vikas Odisha. And our last speaker for today is Mr. Rajiv Khandelwal. He's the co-founder and Executive Director of Ajivika Bureau. And we introduce our topic for today: reverse migration and migration, employment challenges and way forward. We have the questions for our panel. We have seen a phase of reverse migration from urban, semi-urban areas to rural areas. Again, some of the migration is again coming back from rural areas back to the urban, semi-urban areas. What should be the strategy of social development organizations to help both? I would like Apurva to address this question.
Very relevant question at such time. Historically, social organizations have been thematically focused: health, rights, livelihoods, and also geographically focused. So some work in urban areas, some work in rural areas. Now, what this pandemic has taught us is that first it needs a coordinated response, because COVID is not only a health crisis, it's also an economic livelihood crisis, so humanitarian in a way crisis. So there is a need for organizations to reimagine and rethink the work they do, but also rethink the way they partner with other social, because this showed us that this rural-urban divide, which we carefully constructed, is, who is the migrant when he's walking on the highway from Bombay to a village in Bihar? Is he a rural person? Is he an urban person? What is he? So these kind of artificial constructs have actually been in a way broken down, and therefore social organizations need to reimagine how to address this new reality. The second area where social organizations will need to change is also the thematic silos. I work health, I do livelihoods, but when there is a community, like in my Bihar where we work, right now there is a flood, there is a health crisis, COVID, and there is a huge livelihood, agriculture. So, two things can be done. One is we say we will only do this and can't be bothered about the rest. Or we reimagine and partner with people. Or work with the government and see what the government can do, which then we just enable that, while a few things which they cannot do, we do. So I think this crisis actually shows that organizations will need to partner much better and will also need to reimagine their roles both during COVID but in a post-COVID world. These are some of my initiatives.
Those are very good insights, Apurva. Coming to you, Tini, what would be your perspective towards the same issue?
I think we need to work at both ends. During the COVID-19 situation, we've seen a large number of migrants, as you said, go back to their villages. Some of them will now want to stay back in those villages, and therefore there is need for us to actually invest in creating more employment opportunities in villages. Can we do much more in creating safe and secure environments for migrants who now want to go back where work opportunities are there? Also, migrants who have gone to cities with their families. A great motivator to doing that is actually the education opportunities for their children. And if we can create those education opportunities in the villages and in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, I think that would also motivate more people to stay back in their villages. So I would think that we should work at both ends, collaborate greater to create those job opportunities, income earning opportunities in rural areas, in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, and also ensure that migrants who return back to towns and urban centers are provided safe and secure work environments. But then across all civil society organizations, there is a lot of expertise. And if we were to collaborate, like my co-panelist, Rajiv from Ajivika Bureau, they've done an immense work supporting migrants. Now that knowledge, that learning, we can all contribute and create a space from villages to cities, which is a much secure, people-friendly kind of a environment.
That's very insightful, Tenny. So, coming to you, Rajiv, how would you look at this, challenge of migrants moving from urban to rural, and again, partly again from rural to urban?
Thank you, Shahrukh. And I think we have the opportunity to attend to some very overdue priorities. Areas that are very heavy out-migration areas from where large numbers of people go. The nature of migration is very distress-oriented. In all such regions, if we see, there is, I think, renewed scope for looking at local livelihoods, to look at if there is potential again in agriculture, animal husbandry, forestry, and if those could be escalated in order to bring down the distress kind of element in people's decision to move. The other thing that we find, very perverted kind of migration that is taking place through intermediaries, labor agents, contractors, and all such areas where people have come back to now and will go back again. I think there is serious need to monitor and regulate the nature of mediated migration. However, for me, I think the real big scope, which is unattended, lies in urban areas. There is far more innovation and far more, I would say, groundbreaking work in rural livelihoods in rural areas than in urban areas. And I think new way of operating our cities that includes seasonal migrants, that makes sure that everybody has seamless access, is becoming very important. Now, this again does not happen by itself. It needs, facilitating organizations, in CSOs, trade unions, to get involved and to get to work, especially in urban areas. For rural organizations, it's often quite difficult to extend themselves to urban. But I think, especially for the more well-established organizations, I think that time has come to seriously consider that they need to be present at the urban end, because a lot of their people are not in rural areas anymore. They're actually in cities. And that's where they need very substantial support and service.
Great. Thank you very much for these insights. This is for Libby. Do you foresee any change now in the demand and supply for labor in rural areas? What do you think NGOs, social organizations working in rural areas should do to increase availability of employment opportunities? Considering that most of the organizations are now focusing on the skilling part.
Rural communities have come to a greater understanding of how these series of chains of unrelated events come to affect our lives, affect their lives, and how they are at the end of receiving end of factors that work around them. So I think this is a very good opportunity for organizations like ours to kind of engage or re-engage to bring about some fundamental changes. How do I say that? Community-centric organizations like ours, all of us here today, work directly with communities. If we do our preparatory work well, I think it will be possible to motivate and bring about greater behavioral change among rural producers, to for extent. There is sufficient ground to now and question traditional, cropping practices or agronomic choices, or even investment decisions that people take, because we now have something to relate to. COVID ke kaal mein aise hua hai na.
Yes.
So what needs to happen? So I think there is that opportunity that we need to take advantage of. The other aspect is the youth can be influenced, because the youth, they have now realized that global issues affect us this way, and also drawing from the widespread distress around them, we can motivate them to look at local opportunities better. What that means is the skewed resource distribution in rural areas, climate change. When we'll have to address each of this with the community at the center, it cannot be otherwise. It cannot be otherwise. And at least 30% of the workers who've returned from urban areas are likely to stay. That's what our numbers in our area show that. Now, for me, they are a huge resource. They come with a slightly different worldview, different exposure to new ideas, etc. So I think that is a huge resource we can draw upon. Finally, my last point is about technology. We need to bring in technology. Some of it is aspirational, like communication technology, mobile phones or tablets and all that, which are aspirational. But there are also technologies that can improve resilience. For instance, weather forecasting devices, soil sensors, and the kind that can bring about, motivate this behavioral change that can lead to improved economic conditions in the rural areas. Using the youth, driving through the youth, returned migrants, and technology, I think, are methods in which we can probably kind of get this going better.
Coming to our next question, this is for Tini. As a challenge in the workforce, the participation of women sees a steady decline. What do you think are the measures which need to be taken to ensure that the woman's right to work is protected, they get treated fairly in the job market, the post-COVID scenario?
We've seen a low rate of women's workforce participation even without the COVID-19 situation. And I think that needs to be addressed by a strong focus on equality of the girl child in every way, whether it is equality to go to school. What we are picking up also, since schools have been closed for such a long time, is that perhaps when schools reopen, it will be girls who will be kept back. Because for all of these months, they've actually been providing that care, managing the home. So it could be that parents say, कि अब आपको वापस school जाने की ज़रूरत नहीं है. And so I think as a first thing, all of us have to work. How do we motivate girls to come back to school and then stay in school? So I think the whole issue of increasing women's workforce participation is a much wider issue on equality of girls and women in every sphere, whether it is equality of going to school, the right to study, the right to nutrition. We see all of that. There is an unfair in the distribution of food. Women and young girls are adversely affected. And then to invest in the empowerment of women and girls, because every woman who works is also a role model for others. And those role models can then motivate other girls to actually come out and work. So I think we also need to focus on the much wider issue of gender equality in its true sense.
Coming to Apurva, CSRs, corporate funders like HDFC Bank, Parivartan, there was anyways a challenge to balance between, which thematic area to focus on. So be it education or skilling or health on one hand. And now with the emergence of COVID crisis, what would be your message to corporate funders like HDFC Bank in the current context, with COVID coming up, how should they calibrate their response?
Let me redefine what I call the CSR space and role. So CSR is just one part of a larger corporate. The first part is, of course, the work that they will do with NGOs, and I'll come to that in detail. The second is, I think, sensitize the larger corporate also. Because many of the larger corporates, whether it's HDFC, are headquarters in urban areas. In areas from which most of these migrants have come from, whether it's in Bombay, Ahmedabad, Delhi, etc. Most corporate headquarters are in these locations. They have lots of employees. They are in buildings which have been built by migrants. There is a huge, in a way, unrecognized relationship with the body corporate already has with a migrant laborer who's living or settled in that urban space. So through sensitization, I think a lot of, in our country, legislation always takes too much time. So you can have a labor code, you can fight, it'll take whatever. But if the employer is sensitized, and Ahmedabad was very good, we had the Majur Mahajan, the first employers who promoted laborers getting together in the country happened about 100 years ago or 80 years ago. So there are enough examples. So I think that is one whole space where you just examine more carefully that if infrastructure is being done by the body corporate, is the contractor treating the migrant workers well? Are they, is there a space for education? Is the health taken care? Are the women treated with dignity? So there's a lot of that which any body corporate can do. Many of them are doing, but they can do more. Second area, I think, which is very important, and is up the street, but it's not happening, it's not very high investment, is this whole digitization space. See, we are all talking because we all have access to laptops and Wi-Fi, and we are doing this. We've been trying to get in touch with our women's groups everywhere, and over Zoom and over the platform. Data shows that only 16% of rural women have access, forget ownership, over a smartphone. Yeah. Ownership is about 2 or 3%. Now, so what you're doing, and let me give you an example. A long time ago, Nitish Kumar and many other chief ministers, they changed the face of rural girls and rural women by providing free cycles. And Bihar changed because those cycles, the girls got freedom, they went to school, they went to college, they went to work. To me, the new smartphone in the hand of a girl or a woman is the cycle, is the new infrastructure of this. Because your mobility is going to be restricted to some extent. But if you have a smartphone and if you have connectivity, your ability to access entitlements, your ability to look at jobs, your ability to look at education, everything is changing. We are seeing that with people in urban areas, in rural areas, with girls. It's much less. We think, the data says that everybody has a smartphone, blah, blah, blah. But how many of these smartphones are in the hand of women and how many of them are control and access? I think this is a whole digitization space, especially. I think that's a whole area which CSR should look at. We have to create the new infrastructure which is equitable to all. Because right now it's an inequitable infrastructure. The digital infrastructure is not as equitable. Roads are equitable, but digital infrastructure is relatively not equitable. We need to make that equal for. The third area is this whole area. If you have less money, one of the things is the government is putting in a lot of money, but it's not reaching what I call the last mile, or even worse than last mile, because many government officers are not in their offices because they are, they're scared of COVID or whatever. So, if by funding staff and by funding, let's say, entitlement centers, Suchna Kendras or whatever, the leverage can be substantial. A lot of the poor and the disadvantaged people can access their government entitlements if there are just staff and people who help them access. And that is less money, much greater outreach, and you are leveraging government funds and making sure they reach the poorest with very little funds. And the government is not going to do it, so let's not say that the government is going to do it. Somebody will have to do this linking, this last mile connectivity, and CSRs can fund that in a very smart way with using less funds, but you can reach a large number of disadvantaged people. That is, and then the last thing is that migrants, let's say, look at, Rajiv can talk about the urban areas, but in the rural areas, let's say Bihar, we've got about 2.5 crore migrants have come back. Now so each of our villages have about 20-30% more people, right? 10-20%. Now you have an old program which you are doing, but these are now back. So you need some staff, some time to assess the skills of these. So how many of them have land, have livestock, don't have land, don't have livestock? How many have vocational skills, how many don't? You assess them and then co-create programs to make sure that these migrants who have come back with additional skills, they are also gainfully employed. Broken value chains or new value chains are developed. So that this investment which is made by the CSR is not a bottomless pit, but it goes into investments which not only employs and makes the migrants
exactly
get jobs, but it also develops a whole new value chain which then will sustain beyond this initial support will be able. So
Exactly.
I think there are these 4 areas, and in these 4 areas, I think a lot can be done by this thing. I would specifically emphasize, like Tini mentioned, that CSRs can make sure that some part of this funding is exclusively meant for the vulnerable, for women. So that is something which they can, make sure and co-create a design for that. So that again, in this new post-COVID world which is emerging, women again don't get left behind. So I think these are my thoughts on what CSRs can.
Coming to Rajiv, nation is slowly, coming back to the new normalcy. What is your perspective? What do you feel is the role that NGOs and CSR partners, playing along with the government in ensuring that no one is left behind and the problem areas are worked upon?
There is very inadequate work with the informal workforce, with the migrant workforce in cities. And I think we need more organizations to start developing programs and start developing kind of collectives and attend to the issues that are unique to migrants in cities. There are 2 or 3 major issues that I would like to flag that I think we can all get to work. We can get to work to. One thing that we have often looked at largely skilling as the big intervention for the workforce. Over the years, I've understood that skilling per se is very inadequate unless the employment conditions, unless the labor conditions are changing. So one of the things that a lot of us who are kind of skilling missionaries, we have to get to work with is in fundamentally questioning and changing the conditions in which skilled manpower gets employed and attempts are made to retain it, which is why we have one of the highest attrition rates of young people who are entering the labor market because of the conditions that exist. And I think there is huge scope. I'm not suggesting that we drop skilling, but I'm suggesting that we empower skilling by creating conditions in which skilled rural youth can actually stay on. And what are those conditions? Those conditions are improved wages. Those conditions are improved services, improved social security, improved social housing, improved nutritional kind of availability. Everything that makes it possible for young people to be in the labor market. So I would like to move the full attention on skilling away and broaden it to include those issues. Clearly, some of these are issues which have to do with workers' rights. And I think there's a kind of general silence around and reluctance to get involved with issues that are somewhat delicate in nature, right? I think the primary work of those CSRs should be within. It should be down the supply chain. It should be with vendors and suppliers that are creating very mass kind of, very, very difficult kinds of work conditions and informality that we cannot even start documenting. It is to correct that. I think that should be the primary role. And I think that itself would be a huge step forward in the post-COVID scenario. But I strongly feel that we need to do much more with workforce in general, with the Indian laboring kind of segment and laboring class in general. And we should not be afraid of getting into issues that are tougher and more delicate, which is around wages and around work conditions. It should not be just about providing, short-term relief and short-term measures for ameliorating kind of difficulties in the short term. We are in a very, very strange paradoxical situation in which the primary purpose is to cheapen labor. It is labor cheapening. How can we reduce our cost of production, right? Whereas the primary goal should be labor productivity. How did we get this so wrong? If all our efforts are about cheapening labor, then it will mean that we'll compromise on occupational health, on wages, on basic services. Whereas it should be to make labor productive. Any economy that has done well has made sure that labor remains productive, not that it gets cheapened. We have to reverse that, and I really feel that CSRs have a great role in pointing that out, in studying it, in analyzing it, and making it available as strong evidence.
That's a very beautiful point. Focus on labor productivity instead of focusing on reducing the labor cost. That itself will solve most of the problems. Thank you so much for this feedback. If both, starting with Libby and then followed by Tini, if you all could just, give us top 2 priorities for these stakeholders, that only these 2 priorities they should focus on, in the next 6 months.
As you mentioned, Shahrukh, it's often that we kind of operate separately in silos, but I think that is in the nature of things. Government has its job, business has its job, and as community organizations, we have ours. Specifically answer your question, what should government be doing in the next 6 months? The two things that would be high priority for me. Generating that confidence for me is the first expectation from the government. And the second is there's a huge resource of community organizations and community institutions at the ground level, which most state governments have not put to use. With the business sector, especially the CSR sector, I think there is need for a longer term view with flexibility because the situation is just emerging. We thought there is no more need for food relief 2 months ago, but just today, we figured out that 23% of the households in remote Odisha are facing food stress. So, do we go back to relief? And who is ready to pay for that kind of relief today? Because everybody says PDS is reached, but people are just eating rice and nothing more. So there is an evolving situation, and which is none of us are clear about. So the greater flexibility, and let me take my favorite gripe. CSRs need to deal with NGOs, just as Rajiv was talking about industry dealing with workers. It cannot be considered cheap labor. There has to be far more consideration for the cost of operations of organizations that work on the ground. And that's a general issue. It's nothing just COVID specific. As far as NGOs are concerned, I think the need currently is to dig deeper, stay true to our own mandates and mission, and work with the communities to focus on increasing their capabilities to address the vulnerabilities as they are emerging.
So I think linked to, say, the point that Rajiv made and also touching upon what Libby said, I think partnerships would be one thing that this situation has taught us, which we should perhaps intensify and do much more of. The two spaces that I think together CSRs and civil society organizations, NGOs should be do much more of, and is linked to what all of us have spoken about, is the creation of more jobs and enterprise in rural areas, investment in agriculture value chains. That will be a win-win situation for rural communities because they would be able to access better markets, but would also be a win-win situation for migrants who return back and who are looking for sustainable work opportunities. Digital platforms, we need to equalize access to the digital world. So as Apurva said, that the smartphone will be like the bicycle of the future. How can we make that bicycle easily accessible to many, many more people? Say, for example, in the education space, where a lot of the classrooms have gone digital, we see so many children who are not able to access that teaching. So some organizations have taken it upon themselves to actually install a loudspeaker so that children can hear more. So how do we actually facilitate access to digital platforms in a very cost-effective way? One area that I think the government perhaps could really focus on is the whole issue that Rajiv spoke about. That is, let us start measuring ourselves in the productivity of our labor, in the health and well-being of our labor. And social security, the images that have seared our conscience have been the images of migrants walking back thousands of kilometers to their villages. We saw those migrants return to our villages quite broken in spirit. I don't think any of us want to go through that or see that again. So what would it take to ensure that social security, a living wage, for example, but also access to food in times where work is not available? Can we evolve minimum standards for every citizen in terms of, say, the space that they have to live in, the habitat that they have to live in? And then I think much broadly, another thing that, say, the COVID-19 situation has taught us is the significance that our environment, our wildlife, our animals, and our own health is all linked. So I think we need to think much more about the concept of One Health. That's another thing that I think this situation has brought out, that we cannot let go of our environment at the cost, say, of just our GDP. We need to invest in conserving and protecting that space so that all of us continue to have clean water, clean air, and really move towards that One Health kind of an approach. So I think these would be some of the areas that perhaps we should focus on.
That was a very, very good closing remark, Tini. Considering the images that we all saw, migrants walking, no one, needs to go through that. And it is for each of us, a lot of, to sum up the session, many of the work happening in, Parivartan CSR at HDFC Bank, working closely with our partners, looking at, how do we build the capacity at the rural side, looking at skilling, creating entrepreneurs, creating markets, creating employability, creating relevant employability. These are things that are maybe anyways, they are taken care of in our programs. But then also looking at new aspects, some of the gaps which, COVID has identified. What about giving access, digital access to the women, digital access to the girl child so that she has access to the information. Something that Rajiv pointed out, that focus on productivity. Don't just look at reduction in cost. Don't just look at reducing numbers. Improve the resilience, improve, the behavioral mindset. So these are a lot of key takeaways that we've got from the first episode of Parivartan Darpan. From HDFC Bank, the CSR team, HDFC Bank, Parivartan, we genuinely appreciate, Apurva, Libby, Tini, and Rajiv for sparing your valuable time, giving us your valuable inputs that, that we take away as well to implement in our programs, inputs that will help the communities, inputs that will help, create a holistic impact. There's not just one solution or, one size fits all solution that we are looking at. And this is exactly what our first episode of Parivartan Darpan has tried to, bring about. Thank you very much, every one of you. Really appreciate it.